based on a Center for the Business of Government report written by three esteemed authors, two of whom are here today. And we'll hear from them and the key findings that they drew from their analysis in the report, recommendations. We'll encourage your questions during the event in the chat, and we'll have plenty of time for give and take and questioning. And we'll also be hearing from my IBM colleague who runs our defense services business. Before we get to all the introductions, I'm Dan Shannock. I'm the executive director of the IBM Center for the Business of Government. Some of you are probably familiar with our work. We're essentially a think tank in IBM. We work with academic experts like our two authors who are here today, and nonprofit experts who write on topics of interest to government leaders in the US and around the world. And we base this work on a research agenda that's drawn from insights we hear from government leaders and influencers as to where academic research, deep thinking can drive them forward in the coming months and years in a whole variety of topics that can range from technology to management to leadership to public-private partnerships to procurement reform and procurement innovation, the subject that we've written on many times before and the subject of our discussion today. Just again, note that we are using a webinar format. Please put your questions in the chat. I'll keep an eye on those as we move along. And we look forward to a robust discussion from our authors and from our speakers as well. Now I'd like to briefly introduce Mike Labuti, who's joining me. Mike is the, as I said, the leader for the defense services business in IBM. And Mike has experience as a business leader working with OTAs and is very interested in the subject, was a great supporter of the report and a great supporter of our center generally. And Mike wanted to say a few words at the beginning. So Mike, over to you.
Yeah, Dan, thanks very much, and really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this discussion today. I'll say with respect to OTAs, overall for us, I think the pivot has been very positive because I think the use of OTAs really highlights, I'll say some positive cultural changes in the acquisition approach that the department's taking. And so I'll list maybe three for conversation here. First of which I think is collaboration. Traditionally, when we look at FAR-based acquisitions, there's been a limit to the contact between industry and government, during the acquisition process. And I think that that's often led to major disconnects upon award and during program execution, where, the conversations, had they gone on and the collaboration gone on during the acquisition process, I think the ability to align on the key capabilities and the needs for a particular requirement could have potentially avoided some of the challenges that come downstream. I think it's critical also as sort of a subset of that as a part of the collaboration of an OTA, industry partners have an opportunity to truly understand what the users need, right? So creating that user first approach, that user centered design approach, which is something we truly value here. And I know, others in industry do as well. Of late, I think we've seen, a fair bit of innovation, I'll say, around collaboration within the acquisition model. Recently, one of our teams actually, working through an OTA, and the government was using Slack to actually entertain questions and have conversations with industry partners as a part of the acquisition process. So again, I think a great example of collaboration. Another key point I think around the positivity of OTAs is speed. And I think that's both in terms of the acquisition process as well as in terms of delivery. So on the acquisition side, the OTAs present a framework that can really enable DoD to keep pace with the innovations by reducing cycle times in the acquisition process. And we're seeing that time and again. In terms of delivery, it really leads to a critical, capability fielding that happens faster than it ever has in terms of leveraging ways of working that are aligned to best of breed delivery, like Agile, right? And we talked about user-centered design. So, driving to get to an outcome more quickly by virtue of the prototypes that get fielded, then moving to production, just ends up being a better way to field some of these innovative technologies. And finally, I'd say, on the positive side, partnership is really quintessential to being successful within the department, and OTAs really drive that partnership, especially the non-traditional element. So, whereas you see traditional vendors in the space, working almost extensively on projects, the ability to bring this influx of academia, of commercial vendors into the space and pair them with these traditional partners, I think becomes a critical element of OTAs. Now, I do think there are challenges that remain, and I appreciated the report because I think it highlighted a number of them. Some of the key things that we're seeing, I'd say to start with, many DoD organizations still tend to treat OTAs with a FAR-based mindset. In some respects, the collaboration that would be such a positive point of an OTA is not necessarily embraced, and industry is still kind of kept at arm's length, not able to engage in a dialogue. And what's interesting, especially where we see consortiums as the ones that are kind of managing the OTA process, at times they sort of become the layer in between, and it's really vendors engaging with the consortium as opposed to vendors engaging with clients or end users. And it really, I think, is a drawback for the ultimate value. And I think another aspect of that FAR-based mindset is, while looking at and evaluating bids under an OTA construct, often FAR-based principles are applied, which can be a bit of a challenge. So for an example, pricing is an area where we often see a FAR-based construct applied, and it becomes challenging when you have commercial players in particular who are working with you or bidding it themselves, because they're not used to pricing models that lend themselves to FAR-based evaluation. And then, also, I guess the final piece under the FAR-based mindset that's important is that, the flexibility afforded to parties under the OTA is significant, right? Because it allows for room for that innovation. And oftentimes, and I know this was called out in the report, FAR-based terms, FAR-based clauses are included in the OTAs, which can, kind of be a bit of a challenge when it comes to contracting in the OTA framework. I'd say some other key challenges that are something to take a look at as we move forward. Even in spite of OTAs being more oriented towards innovation, it seems that more and more we're seeing that OTAs rely very heavily on investment up front from industry. In fact, heavy investment at times where there's little to no funding available for these initial prototypes, which is ironic because it would probably be the place where you'd want to apply the funding, right? When you're driving innovation, that's where you want to put the funding. But oftentimes we're seeing that money is not available up front, and there's heavy investment required from industry for these initial phases of these OTAs. And finally, and this is somewhat unique to DoD, but when you look at some of the capabilities that we're looking to kind of bring through the OTA framework, some of those are classified requirements, and so when clearances are required, that gets to be a bit challenging when you start to introduce non-traditional players into the space. We've had instances where working with our clients, bidding on an OTA and having participants from non-traditional companies or academia where the workforce isn't cleared. They're bringing great innovation, but how do you balance that against the security requirements? It can be a bit tricky. So, again, I'd say, Dan, overall, we're viewing that OTAs are certainly a positive step. They're creating some very positive cultural changes, and really driving the collaboration that we need to see between industry and government. Definitely some things to iron out as we move forward, but overall, I think a good change in the acquisition cycle. So, Dan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Mike. Great insights, and I think a great setup for the discussion that Stan and Jason will lead us through momentarily in terms of drawing insights from the report and adding a layer of experience from the industry side. And I know many of folks on the call and who will be commenting in the chat represent different elements of industry and that collaborative partnership that you spoke to. So with this in mind, when we received the proposal for a paper on OTAs, we knew that it was a topic that was of high interest to government. And so we are grateful to Stan and Jason and their co-author Vincent for bringing this to us and for delivering such a terrific report. So let me introduce our two speakers today, both of whom wrote for us wearing a hat with Hacking for Defense, which is a defense innovation curricular initiative piloted at Stanford University and now in place at more than 50 universities in terms of its application. More specifically, Jason came from the Defense Department. He a period of years of service there, and also in the Defense Innovation Unit in his most recent stage at DoD. And he left DoD and is now, among other things, the leader of Visva Lab, which is a human-centered design consultancy. Jason, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, and Stan Soloway. Stan is the former Deputy Undersecretary for Defense for Acquisition Reform. Many know Stan from his years of work as the CEO of the Professional Services Council. Stan is also a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration, where I am also a fellow, and he is currently the head of Celera Strategies. Welcome, Stan.
Hello, Dan. Great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Again, we're in a webinar format. Please put your questions and thoughts in the chat. We'll kind of monitor the chat as we go. And I'll be asking Stan and Jason a series of questions. Might interject with comments from you all if relevant. Otherwise, we'll go through and then do all the comments at the end. So we'll kind of play that by ear. So feel free to keep your keyboard going in terms of making comments. So let's step back from the remarks that Mike led us through and kind of think a little bit of first in terms of history. And Jason, you lived this history at DoD. Talk about the title of the report is OTAs 60 years on, hitting their stride or hitting the wall. So talk about that 60-year evolution for a few minutes.
Right. So I'll give you the quick 5-minute version of 60 years of history. There's a great longer history and legislative history in the report itself, in the annexes. But really, what is an OTA is in the acronym Other Transaction Authority. They're transactions other than the normal acquisition process, and these came about basically during the space race with Sputnik, with Russia launching this satellite. The first thing you could actually visually see going over your head. People were afraid that Russia was going to, drop bombs on their head as it flew over their houses in the middle of the night. And then also the nuclear arms race. And so NASA was looking for a way to get access to acquisitions and purchase things faster and in a more commercial way than what they currently had in 1959. And NASA maintained that authority all the way through the 60s, the 70s, all the way up in through the 80s, when Congress actually started discussing pushing temporary authority over into DARPA and the Department of Defense. And that became permanent around 1993, when DARPA got the permanent extension, and around 1999, we started having discussions in the acquisition reform era of what would it look like for OTAs to be able to go to production. Around this time, we had a little bit of experimentation going on, and a major project transitioned from DARPA into DoD in 2003 into the Army, called the Future Combat Systems Program. And the Future Combat Systems Program was a massive effort to modernize aircraft, munitions, communications, computer networks, all under a single OTA that was awarded to Boeing. But if you actually dig into it, this OTA looked a lot like a conventional FAR contract. So even though they awarded using the OTA authority, it looked like any other FAR contract. If any of you know the history of Future Combat Systems, not an example of a successful program in DoD. Around 2005, the program started getting in trouble, started getting pulled into a bunch of congressional hearings, and one of the themes was that OTAs were to blame for the failure of Future Combat Systems to actually deliver. If you pull the string, and this is a little bit of opinion on my side, the failure of Future Combat Systems was in the complexity and the structure of the contract as more of a FAR contract versus a flexible OTA versus the actual OTA vehicle itself, right? If you look into modern agile development principles, just the complexity of what the Army was attempting under the Future Combat System put the entire system at a large amount of risk just at its formation. So in 2009, the program was canceled, and which really led to a lot of acquisition officials that were around in 2009 and senior acquisition officials saying, we know the OTAs exist, but why would we take the risk with the OTA? And also saying, I can do anything I want under the FAR. About this time too, you had the kickoff of Afghanistan, and we ended up having Iraq and Afghanistan, and you had the problem of improvised explosive devices. And our solution was to rapidly go through and do an acquisition based upon a joint urgent operational need for IED resistant vehicles. And that vehicle was the MRAPs. That was done very rapidly, over about 12 months of prototyping. It was delivered at scale and really succeeded in countering the IED threat and saving a lot of service members' lives. About that time, also, a lot of other things were being pushed through in JUONs, the Joint Urgent Operational Needs. And DoD was standing up the Rapid Reaction Technology Office and the Rapid Capability Offices in the different services. Eventually, like the need for these rapid and flexible acquisitions to support the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, and as well as other programs in the DoD, was growing past the capability of these offices to do it, and people started looking back towards OTAs. Fortunately, there was a little bit of excess capacity and organization within the Army that was left over from Future Combat Systems training. And so the Army started developing out these consortia to be able to manage the other transactions. At the same time, concurrently, we had Secretary Carter and you had Bob Work, who were pushing this Defense Innovation Initiative and what they're calling the third offset. Under the third offset, Secretary Carter established the Defense Innovation Unit, experimental at that time. The Strategic Capabilities Office established the Office of Innovation within DoD, and was really pushing this narrative that innovation was actually the offset, our ability to rapidly get to new technologies. And on top of that, you had the after effects of the healthcare.gov I'm going to say debacle, which the solution to that was really bringing Silicon Valley into government and pushing out those things. And so you ended up getting things like AT&F and the Defense Digital Service out of that. So under this confluence, we really have the modern times where the Defense Innovation Unit was able to innovate within the OTA process and deliver a commercial solutions opening, which with the consortiums, they're being mainly run through Army contracting commands, as well as the Defense Innovation Unit, showing people that these things could be done, including the AIRS program, which was done out of Army's TARDEC program, going out and educating people about OTAs. You saw a large expansion of OTAs currently in the future. And so where we're at right now is we are using OTAs across all the services. Air Force is using the most of them. And we just had a major OTA success with Operation Warp Speed, where a interagency organization, including Defense Innovation Unit, Army Contracting Command, National Institute for Health, among others, got together and used OTAs to procure the vaccines and to be able to do the procurements to respond to COVID-19. So I'll pause there. There is your 10-minute history of 60 years of OTAs. Right now, they're in growth, in use, and the question we asked is, if they're growing and in use, are they meeting the basic tenets of public procurement that we know we need to have in place to be able to have solid acquisitions and protect the taxpayer dollar?
So thanks, Jason. And that 10-minute summary will now be required, required viewing at all procurement courses that have to do with OTA. So we'll send that around. Stan, given Jason's framing and the comments that Mike made around OTAs and the relationship to public procurement, step back and talk a little bit about the philosophy of public procurement, the tenets of public procurement in terms of integrity, and how OTAs do or don't are or are not consistent with those tenets.
Sure, sure. And I think Jason could also try out for the 60 Minutes Shakespeare Theatre in London, where they do entire plays in no time at all. Let me just add one quick point to what Jason talked about. It was an excellent summary. There was another major change about 5 years ago, and that was finally recognized by Congress, something a lot of us have been pushing for 20 years, that it's all well and good to have an innovative process for research and development, but if you can't translate or transition that innovative relationship into production, it retards the relationships and you can't move forward. And so it was limiting the effectiveness of OTAs, and Congress passed what's known as production authority, which allows OTAs to be used through the life of a program or a capability, which really started to open the floodgates. And I think in the last 6 years or 5 years, we've seen from about $500 million to, I think the last number I saw for FY21 was about $12 billion. So a massive increase, some of which has been driven by the knowledge that we can take this to market, if you will, to use a private sector term. But to your question, Dan, that was really the core issue that Jason and I started talking about when we came to you with this idea, because we've been in and around a lot of debates around OTAs and innovation and so forth, and always kept hearing the refrain, oh, OTAs are great as long as they're used appropriately, or as long as they're used in this area, but don't use them too broadly because they're for this. And we looked at it and said, so what is this and what does appropriate mean and how do you define appropriate? And it was a lot of talk, but there wasn't a lot of specificity. And the more we looked at it, the core question became, if in fact OTAs cannot align with public procurement, as you put it, the ethos of public procurement, then in fact they're going to have a very limited life cycle, a very limited scope of application. They will be special. But if they do align with the ethos of public procurement, the question then becomes, why wouldn't they become substantially more prominent in the system? I mean, even at $12 billion, they're a minor player given the hundreds of billions that go into procurement every year. But what would the limitations be, and why would there necessarily be limitations? And could they even become a peer or near peer to traditional FAR contracts? But the real question was looking at the underneath the covers, or peel back the onion, whatever metaphor you want to use, to see what these agreements look like. So, when we think about public procurement, as I've thought about it for the 30 plus years I've been in it, there's really a set of core issues. One is clearly accountability. When we do business with the private sector or even nonprofits through grants or what have you, is there accountability for delivery? Are there consequences for failure to delivery? Is there accountability for costs? So we can prevent from getting gouged? These are tax dollars we're talking about, the whole span of accountability. Second is transparency. A democracy by definition is supposed to be transparent. Government is supposed to be transparent. It's not a private company operating somewhere off over here. It represents all of us. So is there transparency? Is there visibility into what's going on? And then the third basic tenet, and really one of the reasons that the term other transactions authority actually exists, is the idea of competition. So the reason that in the procurement parlance you have OTAs and contracts as two different things is because under federal procurement law, contracts are defined as those vehicles that are covered by the Competition and Contracting Act. They're CEQA covered. So technically, from a purely legal perspective, an OTA is not subject to CEQA, therefore it's not a procurement contract. But nonetheless, the question of competition is central. So what we did very early on, in addition to doing the historic research and really starting to talk to dozens and dozens of people of every level you can imagine of government and also in the private sector who've worked with them, is we actually looked at a set of redacted OTs. We wanted to see exactly what was in these agreements. And before I tell you sort of what we found, and I'll do that very quickly, I will say that part of the interest in this was driven by a study that we did when I was at DoD back in the late 90s, when we were first discussing with Congress the idea of production authority for OTAs. And we wanted to look at what do the OTAs we have on the ground look like now, because in the late 90s, OTAs were still relatively new to DoD. We'd only had the authority for a few years. And what we found at the time was that most of the OTAs, and we did a random sampling, looked very much like a FAR Part 12 contract. And for those who are not familiar with the parlance, Part 12 is commercial items and services. but it was a FAR Part 12 contract as FAR Part 12 was written and originally implemented in the 1990s. So that so the question, Jason, I want to look at was, is that still true? What do they look like? What are the gaps? Fast forward to our research, and what we found was, first of all, they are very competitive. I mean, even the GAO has said repeatedly that OTAs are increasingly competitive. And I think the figure now, I don't have the report right in front of me, but I think it's about 75% of OTAs are competitive, which, by the way, exceeds significantly the average level of competition for general procurement. So competition is not an issue. Now, one could say, well, you have the consortiums and they limit competition, but think of a consortium as a multiple award contract. It's the same idea. Some of the consortiums have 1,500 or more, 2,000 members. Now, maybe only those 2,000 members have access to a given opportunity, but that's still 2,000 potential bidders. And under CICA, that's more than adequate for competition. That's much like our multiple award contract process works. DIU, where Jason was when he was in the Navy, DIU is an unlimited universe of bidders because their opportunities, their commercial services openings are posted publicly on their website. And anybody who thinks they have the capability can respond. So competition's not an issue. From the question of transparency and accountability, what we found was the contracts were largely very well written. They had very clear deliverables. Under the rules, they are auditable. And you sometimes hear people say, well, we can't audit them. Well, you can't audit them under the cost accounting standards. We heard Mike talk a little bit earlier about the tendency to inject government pricing rules and so forth. No, they're not subject to CAS, but they are auditable under generally accepted accounting principles. Now, I think I would argue very strongly, and Jason and I would both argue very strongly, that's more than adequate for what we're doing here. And by the way, once you go to production, you have so much visibility into the capability. Sticking with that accounting process should not be all that big a deal. The rest of the world operates on GAAP. I mean, we can get into a whole conversation on whether the use of CAS has been excessive and so forth. But from a accountability and transparency, auditability perspective, very clearly they meet those tests. And they're quite transparent. I mean, there are reports delivered. DIU reports annually to DOD. The consortiums report to their sponsors within DOD. There's a fair amount of information out there about them, and you can see where the dollars are going and so forth. All of that said, and I'll stop on this point, there are gaps in the transparency piece. So one of the big questions that Jason and I have come out with is there is a tremendous amount of data available, but there's only limited amounts of data that's accessible. And that there are individual reporting lines between operations and sponsors, whether a consortium or not, but there's a lot more of that data that can and should be made public. Second, as we define transparency and accountability, we have to be very careful what we're asking. Most of the measurements, and this was partly why we wanted to do this report, most of the measures of the quote effectiveness of other transactions has been looking at the dollars that go to non-traditionals versus traditionals. In our view, that's exactly the wrong measure. First of all, as Mike said, one of the primary benefits of an OTA is it enables a traditional contractor to serve as the funnel for a new capability. Now, that new capability may be a substantial piece of the puzzle, or in the nature of technology today, it could be a relatively minor piece from a cost perspective, but have massive operational implications. So outcomes as opposed to dollars has to be really much more clearly reported, and I think more clearly shared publicly to the extent that that you can do that. So there's a lot of data that we can share more publicly. We don't have concerns about what the data will show because everything we looked at and the folks we talked to, there is largely a good news story there, and where there's not, people should know about it anyway. So transparency could be improved by greater data sharing. The final point, from a FAR, non-FAR perspective, and Mike touched on this, although I was surprised he didn't touch on this one big issue, and that is the biggest problem we see, as Mike put it, is this tendency of the culture as we approach transition from development into production to reassert sort of a FAR-based mindset. And the most dramatic way is through the application or imposition of intellectual property clauses. IP is, by all of the interviews that we did and all the experience Jason's actually had hands-on experience doing OTs, is the single largest barrier to an effective transition. So what is happening, and this is largely anecdotal, there's very little data on this, and it's another area where it'd be interesting to look at, is everybody we talked to, literally, and Jason, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think there was a soul that we talked to who didn't say, who's had experience doing OTAs, that the non-traditional player was either licensing their capability at the end to a prime or to the government for the immediate use case, and essentially, if not entirely, exiting the market. Now that has a lot of implications. I could use a flippant analogy and said, you want to have a marriage, not a fling. But what you really want is you want access to that human capital and that capability that generated that technology to begin with on an ongoing basis. So there are limits to that, to how those relationships are being able to be built. And a lot of it is around how the government thinks about IP and still struggles to deal with IP on a very commercial basis. We also hear issues about CASP requirements starting to crop up and so forth. But I'll give you one example. I know there was one company that we spoke to, and I can't mention their name, that spent 2 years in negotiations over IP on an OTA. And ultimately they completely caved and gave into the government because they couldn't afford not to. And what really happened was, and again, I spent my career trying to, like you do, Dan, we're all about trying to make government work better. The government was playing the I can do this because I can do this, as opposed to I'm going to do this because I need to do this. So there's some real balancing acts with IP and other requirements that need to be factored in, and they are really proving to be a big barrier, I think, to the growth of other transactions. Let me stop on that and get to the other questions.
Oh, thanks, Dan, for walking us through that relationship. And Jason, you talked about, excuse me, relationship and implementation in the Defense Department. And Mike talked about a number of challenges. And let's go, we talked about the past, we talked about the present. Let's go into the future a little bit. How will OTAs sort of address these 21st century challenges, not just within DoD, but sort of broader national security, international affairs work, the world that we're moving into? How do OTAs relate to the FAR in that environment? How can they be leveraged? Stan mentioned $12 billion out of a roughly $500 billion industry that's likely to grow after the passage of the recent stimulus bills and the infrastructure bill. So talk about that connection to the future and how OTAs can really provide a launching point.
Right. So as Stan pointed out, we looked at the history of OTAs and we looked at, do they meet the basic tenets of public procurement? And with a couple of issues, the reporting issue, the issue with our ability to transition, they do. And so if we are able to transition and scale OTAs in a way that really gets you to FAR parity for the things that OTAs are good for, now you're looking at a capability that you can actually acquire full-on weapon systems, and you can actually adapt to ongoing situations in the world. And so the way, really where Stan and I started talking about this was coming out of an MPS acquisition symposium, where we had a couple of unsatisfying engagements with some of the speakers. And one of those engagements was with a deputy IWO, information warfare officer. He is the senior person in the battle group for information operations. And he got into an argument with the senior Navy procurement official in the public forum. And he was saying, why have you not delivered capability that's useful to me? And the senior acquisition professional was, we delivered on time, on budget, and with the performance that was in the requirement. Why are you not happy? And he went back and said, hey, have you not looked at the national defense strategy? How are you achieving national security objectives via your acquisitions? And the senior acquisition professional looked at him and said, it is not our responsibility to read the national defense strategy. We follow the federal acquisition requirements. And so the epiphany for me and the sort of the conversation we walked out of is, how do we make these things more operational? And we're looking at OTAs as a way of doing it. And really what you end up with, and to kind of look at the structure of how the Department of Defense in particular is structured, is there is this operational chain of command that runs the Chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff and down through, that's executed via the component commands and the component commanders to execute war. They do strategies, they do operations. And there's an administrative side, which man trains and equips. It acquires things and prepares them for the operational fight. So, unknown to a lot of people, like the chief of naval operations doesn't really do operations. The chief of naval operations, with his chief of naval operations hat on, is the chief acquirer for the Navy, the chief trainer for the Navy, and the similar for the other heads of the services. And so what we have really is we have an acquisition system that is optimized for the man, train, and equip. And it is not optimized to support national security objectives. And if you go into the history of OTAs and you look at when were OTAs implemented and successful? The space race. So we had a emergent threat in Russia. We couldn't go through the man, train, and equip NASA acquisition cycle, so we developed OTAs, right? I will, pin up Skunk Works in the 1960s, 1970s. We'll spin off an entire separate organization that's going to build out essentially an air power capability for the next 40 years. And then you have wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, MRAPs. So we are going to build a separate urgent operational needs structure and fund it separately with a separate pot of money and build these rapid capability offices outside of the acquisition chain. You had the Defense Innovation Unit, and you had Strategic Capabilities Office during the third offset sort of era. Those were separate organizations that are targeted to go that. Oh, and by the way, DARPA was the same kind of thing when it originally kicked off. And then finally, you have Operation Warp Speed, where we had a critical cross-national, national defense, national security issue with COVID-19, and we responded by going outside of the normal acquisition process to meet national security needs. And so the opportunity here for an OTA in the time of, emergent national competition with mostly China, but also an emergent Russia and great power competition, where we're really competing again in this acquisition technology space for access to 5G, quantum, access to companies that can do that, is to look at how can we build out a acquisition system, not acquisition reform, right? I don't need to change the way that we buy toilet paper. I need to change the way we use the acquisition system to go after emergent operational needs in support of national security objectives. And the federal acquisition requirements is just written to support man, train, and equip, with a couple of exceptions. OTAs have the ability and the flexibility to actually become a tool set in a operational commander's tool bag when I need to apply acquisition operations to get a actual effect on the battlefield or to influence the direction for national security objectives. I need to be able to apply something. And based upon the history and the current expanded capability of OTAs and their ability to be flexible in the future, I see OTAs as really the only methodology and the only authority we currently have to be able to do acquisitions as warfare, acquisitions as operations, and support national security objectives.
So Dan, if I could just add to that real quick before we move on to the next question. There's a couple of other pieces to this puzzle that I think are relevant and something we go back to and this is in the report, we go back to sort of where all of this started, as Jason talked about the space race in the late 50s. But the next great sort of historic shift that took place in the United States was really in the mid 70s. And that's the first time in history that the private sector began outspending the government in research and development. And since that time, of course, the lines have gone like this, and we're now at like something around $4 to $5 of every private sector spend for $1 of federal spend. So what that means is the ownership of technology has shifted fundamentally. So you have that factor. The second piece is that, and you know this better than we do in the work that you all do as a company, not just as a center, but as IBM, with the pace of technology today, you fall back further faster. So the pressure to keep pace is greater than it's ever been. And third, the nature of warfare itself is no longer about the skin. It's no longer about the jet. It's no longer about the ship. It's not as much about it's not as much about the tank. It's all about the technology inside it, or the technology irrespective of an actual vehicle to deliver it. In other words, whether it's the use of of AI and bots and analytics, and all the different tools we hear, hypersonics and so forth. All of those have major commercial analogs. There's tons of commercial money going into that. And so the fundamental challenge with the federal acquisition system, which I don't think we need to get rid of, I'm not saying we should dump the FAR, but so much of it is written or at least practiced, because we don't always practice the way it's written. I mean, the FAR, theoretically, you could do all of this under the FAR, but it's just too complicated. It's written for a monopsony environment. It's written for a world where there's one major customer. That is no longer the world we live in. So I think that context, when Jason talks about the fight, it's not just the direct fight, it's using OTAs for supply chain solutions, for distributed ledger and financial management solutions. Anything we can do to drive real innovation in the administrative side frees up resources, enables us to focus more better on the mission side. And that's true whether in the military, Homeland Security, or any other agency of government. And that's why OTA use you start seeing being used for business operations. So I just thought that context was a little bit was part of what you were trying to get to.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Stan. And by the way, we talked before about Jason's opening being required viewing and procurement innovation courses. Your use of the term monopsony means that this will also go into economics curricula around the country, at least in the Hacking for Defense curricula that you all wrote from. So just a reminder, we have a terrific group of folks in the virtual audience. Please put your questions in the chat, and we'll get to those in a few minutes. We have sort of our final question as a panel, so we look forward to a robust discussion thereafter. But Stan, you talked a little bit about other than DoD uses, and you talked in the report as well, you and Jason and Vincent, about other agencies picking these up. So think more broadly from sort of a strategic policy strategy perspective for Congress, the administration, with regard to how does this relate to Title X, to other key statutory frameworks that influence acquisition. Think about some specific recommendations that you're drawing from the report that might be helpful to us as we think about next steps.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of pieces to that puzzle. It's a great question. We tried to cover most of them in the report. I'm not sure we got to all of them. Let me start with the way we started the report, which was facts first. We need to demystify the authority. There's too much perception across the system that this is some sort of exotic tool or exotic vehicle that people are using, when what we found is that it's a pretty disciplined process. There's solid documents. It has rules. It has guardrails. So we need to demystify the process, first of all. Second, I think it's important to recognize that Congress, interestingly, is probably the leading cheerleader here. Congress has been repeatedly not only expanding the authorities, but when you talk to folks on the Hill, and we've had the opportunity to brief this report to both the House and Senate Armed Services Committees, there is a little bit of frustration that OTAs hadn't been more broadly used, even within the confines of the current authority. So there is a lot of support for innovation, but I think demystification is the first strategy. The second thing is, I think there needs to be a better effort at engaging other stakeholder organizations. This is not a contracting issue. This is not even just a big A acquisition issue. This is a mission issue, and this regardless of what agency you're in. So we need to have all the different functionals and stakeholders involved in the conversation, familiar with and then comfortable with the process. And that's not how we develop our workforce. That's not how we're organized broadly across government, whether DoD or other agencies. So we need to be stepping back and thinking organizationally about how do we imbue some of this. And really what Jason was talking about, and I think the core of a lot of what you were asking, Dan, is how do you take an innovation that works and actually embed it across an enterprise? It's great to have an innovation office in Texas or in California or wherever it might be, but as they are successful or demonstrate replicable capabilities, how do you begin to imbue that across the enterprise? That's really what we're talking about here. And the enterprise is not just the acquisition community. A lot of the push for this is, in fact, in DoD coming from the military side. It's coming from the operational side. Jason's former colleagues lieutenants, lieutenant commanders, captains coming up through the system, pushing their leadership, saying we can do this because we know this about technology, and really pushing it that way. The third thing I'd say from a strategic level, as opposed to specifically tactical, is we really need to think about how we develop a workforce that is comfortable with and expert in execution. And we in the report talk about the creation of an agreement corps that would be for the Defense Department, be a joint, we would think should be a joint operation. We would want to also be doing it in the civilian agencies. I mean, Homeland Security is increasingly talking and has the authority and increasingly using CSOs and maybe moving more into production for OTAs. But we need a workforce that is really not only fully versed and quote trained, but culturally attuned to it. And one of the interesting things we found is that DARPA, which has a tremendous amount of experience with OTAs, to be an agreements officer at DARPA, you have to be a contracting officer, but you also have to demonstrate the aptitude. There is a sort of test-in kind of approach that Wes Bennett and others there have implemented. In the Navy, Hondo Gertz, who of course recently stepped down, and Cindy Shaver had a process where they actually didn't rely on the 1102 workforce, not because they weren't good 1102s, but because they were concerned that they'd been so enmeshed in the rigidity or the traditional far thinking. They wanted people who were completely unfettered, who who didn't have any of that. Now, whether that's fair to the 1102s or not isn't the question, but the point is that folks are beginning to think about how to develop that. And I think that ought to be, from an investment perspective, that would be hugely valuable to really develop the right kind of workforce. And by the way, the Defense Acquisition University, which I would argue has been slow to the table, has recently started to come up with some, I think, fairly progressive and forward-leaning curricular approaches for the defense acquisition community. But again, it's broader than just acquisition, and that's I think a piece that we need to drive home.
Thanks, Dan. Jason, anything you want to add to that?
Well, I think I see Chris Zember asked a question over here.
I was going to get to that. I didn't know if you wanted to say anything further. Otherwise, I'll go right to Chris's question. Does that work?
Yeah, go to that and I'll combine responses. Okay,
so just to, since not everybody may be able to see the chat, Christopher Zember asks you to expand further on your comment about man, train, equip in terms of how OTAs can enable a better response to achieve national security objectives more deeply. So why don't you take that on?
Okay, so I think Stan, right at the end of his comments, like all the comments, we should go back and reread those and then turn those into actual legislative actions. But right at the end, Stan talked about the building of a agreement corps. And so this is really with specialized experience. I always think about this as like conventional operations versus special operations, right? I want a specialized group of people, with specialized training, who are able to work across the entire spectrum. And so we're really looking at groups of people that include program/product managers, contract officers, lawyers, even folks in the venture capital community. You're looking at an integrated team. And even if we're looking at like acquisition operations, acquisition warfare, you're looking at bringing in some Title X folks, some folks who know how to do operational strategic planning within the context of the other plans. And so the first is to build these core teams and to really task them in going out and looking at this. How do I do acquisitions to achieve national security objectives? Not to achieve requirements, right? Requirements still exist. The normal acquisition process still exists. How do I do it for this niche piece here? And so if we're doing acquisition warfare and acquisition operations, we're really looking at supporting what's in the joint publications in joint warfare. And so the functions listed in the joint publications are these: the functions of any operation: command and control, intelligence, information, movement and maneuver, fires, and sustainment. And so if you look at any sort of joint publication, whether it's like cyber warfare or cyber operations, information operations, kinetic operations, special operations, each one of these realms have to address how they're going to interrelate with the other warfighting domains in order to achieve these effects. And so if we're looking at like a command and control of acquisition forces, we brought up Slack. Mike brought up Slack in the very beginning, right? The ability to use Slack is a command and control function. The ability to organize, communicate to your forces, and issue and coordinate actions. Right now, we use message traffic and email and Microsoft Project and Excel spreadsheets. In an acquisition warfight, that's probably not sufficient. So you would actually need man, train, equip actions to support this operational acquisition force. Intelligence, right? Looking at foreign ownership control and interest issues, looking at cyber attacks on your network, like looking at business intelligence, right? What are vulnerable companies? What are companies that are vulnerable to having Chinese investors move onto the board, right? Or Russian investors move onto the board, right? Which one are already have control issues? Which ones are at risk of failing? Which ones are critical in our supply chain? Information, how do I store and retrieve that information, computer systems and things like that. Movement, let's movement and maneuver, right? If I know that, for example, in Australia, there is a specific chip manufacturer, right, that can only manufacture this chip, how do I ensure that we have access and we are pre-positioned to be able to access those technologies? What about, the big one for me was Sri Lanka, right? I was on the USS Blue Ridge. We pulled into a big, with Secretary Carter, went into India. We pulled into Sri Lanka. We went into India. As we're coming back, they announced that China had acquired the port in Sri Lanka, right? So we've lost access. We've lost the ability to maneuver in that space. Fires. How do I apply capital in order to achieve operational effects? And so this is really the fires piece is really the piece that I'm looking at for OTAs, right? There are acquisition options, but in the other domains, but really, how do I rapidly apply capital to a problem to acquire a company, to go out and corner a market, or get access to an area, or whatever. I need to be able to do that in a flexible and creative manner that cannot be constrained by this legalism of FAR-based clauses. And again, I'm not arguing against the FAR-based clauses. I'm saying they're not operationally advantageous to us when we're trying to meet national security objectives. And finally, sustainment. Sustainment, right? As we're doing that, how do I ensure that the capital is available for us to continue conducting acquisition fires, continue conducting intelligence, right? As I'm in this warfight. I mean, you're looking like board takeovers. You're looking at all of these sort of activities. And by the way, if we're talking acquisition warfare and we're talking Title 10, we're really talking about the application of acquisitions as violence. Is really, if warfare is the application of national security objectives by violence versus state by diplomacy, right? Department of Treasury has its efforts. We're talking about Title 10 DoD. We're talking about going in for national security objectives and rapidly applying that capital. How do I sustain that? And that looks like, some sort of venture funding mechanism, some sort of ability to keep a war chest and keep that filled outside of the normal budgeting cycle, right? We just saw OCOA, our operational OCOA funding, the funding from Afghanistan that was outside of the normal budget process just was eliminated. Really, that's what we're talking about, that kind of a budget that's used for operational purposes. And so, and then we need to look at doing that across the spectrum of operations, right? And as we look at the phases of operations, and I'm sorry, I'm going really into a lot of, military planning type stuff. We're looking at being able to apply this in the shaping phase before any sort of actions happen, the deterrent phase, as things are spinning up. How do I provide acquisition operations via these mechanisms to deter and bring us back into a phase zero. Things are going really bad. How do I seize the initiative? And if we are in a competition for example, Sputnik space race type race for nuclear weapons, how do I dominate the adversary, right? How do I win that war, right? Am I using conventional kinetics to bomb ball bearing factories? I bring up these sort of large examples. There's many places where we have done this sort of acquisition operations, acquisition warfare. But to try to answer Chris's question, we need to have the right people in place with the right training that are operating under the right authorities in order to do the operations we need to do at the time of our choosing. Our current acquisition system is not set up to do that, and there's no acquisition reform effort that will do that, because there's no acquisition reform effort that will both protect our ability to man, train, equip, and execute as the FAR does, and protect the taxpayers the FAR does, and execute in our national security objectives as we need in a flexible manner. And so OTAs, yes, I think OTAs play a role in the man, train, equip. But the opportunity here is, if OTAs can be used to leverage large amounts of capital at the same level that a FAR-based contract can, we can also use them with the right people to basically fight an acquisition war and do acquisition operations as a part of joint operations. And I'll pause there.
Really terrific insights, Jason, and thinking about the great power competition questions of the 21st century. A way to think about this concept of public-private partnerships through acquisition, and this concept you're talking about acquisition warfare as a tool of the trade. There's a question that I think is very relevant. The next question in the chat coming from Tanya, which is about the people. And you mentioned that a number of times, Jason, in laying this out. And Stan, I wonder if you could speak to this. And Mike, I would like to turn to you after that. Thanks for joining us for the Q&A. Tanya's question is, a lot of government procurement officials say we don't have time to learn about OTAs. How do you create an environment, and Stan, you and I have talked about this many times over the years, that really promotes acquisition innovation, enables, rewards learning, expands this, both from the government side, and then Mike, I think it's incumbent on industry to also kind of raise its game to be able to work on this. So if you could think about that after Stan talks about the government equation, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think Dan, and I think Tanya's question is a great one, and I think there's two answers to it. But she also posed another part of the question, which is, who's going to be the champion to actually make this happen? And you and I have beaten ourselves in the head for years about who do we get to can actually make this a reality. So one is, and it ties back to something you helped create and is still around, is this concept of thinking about acquisition from an organizational rather than individual perspective. It's not just about, did a contracting officer get a contract in place? It's about a whole cultural, and it's a set of characteristics or descriptors of an organization and how they operate in the marketplace, both internally and externally. And I won't get into a whole discussion, but the work you did on acquisition of the future and looking at sort of maturity models, organizational maturity models have a way of driving individual performance. And because you're not just focused on Mike, you're focused on all four of us on the screen right now and how we work as a team. So there's that piece. I think the second part is, we've had this problem for many, many years. I can't spare my people to go to training. So because everybody's overworked, and this is true, we have probably not enough people for the workload that's out there. That's another advantage of creating a core dedicated to this work. So it's a separately funded, separately resourced core that is actually dedicated and focused on innovative acquisition, OTAs, and it can be other tools as they evolve or come to bear. But to just simply suggest that every contracting officer ought to just be sent out to get OTA training and they can come back and do it, I just don't think is realistic given the workloads they face, given the internal cultural challenges they face. When I was in the department, we put in the continuous learning requirement, and it wasn't just an incentive, it was a requirement to retain your certification. We said you had to have 80 hours whatever it was, every 2 years of continuous learning. I had people saying to me, yeah, it's great. I'm going to get in great continuous learning. I come back to my organization. Nobody else in the organization knows what the heck I'm talking about. And so it has to be a dedicated core that can build its own culture and own operational model, um, rather than being reliant on other duties as assigned, if you will. And this is true whether you're at Homeland Security, HHS, DOD. When Jason talks about acquisition warfare, you can apply the concept to any mission of the government. You just have to step back and look at it in that same construct.
So if I could, Stan, just piggyback on what you were saying, I love what you said about a cultural shift. I mean, the same is true within industry, right? I mean, industry has long paced itself and its approval processes and how it approaches acquisition aligned with the timeline associated with typical FAR-based acquisitions, right? And if you think about, what it takes to acquire, MDAPs or ACAT-1 programs, whatever they are, large programs with a lot of money tied into them, it's a cumbersome process, right? I mean, it can take years, and sometimes those don't even manifest themselves into awards. But the agility that can be afforded to the process by virtue of using the OTA construct in the right way is a very different paradigm that industry needs to keep pace with as well. And so I know for our part, we've been looking at adapting that culturally with our own corporation, trying to figure out how to change our processes to be more nimble, how to ensure that we're able to produce capabilities, demo style, to drive the experience up front and be able to engage with our clients, whereas in the past, we haven't necessarily. So again, all of that is, as you say, a cultural mind shift in terms of how we in industry also address the acquisition lifecycle, because it is very different than what I think many are used to as they respond. So,
Absolutely great points. And you've all talked about agility in the acquisition process and OTAs enabling that. I would mention that there is an initiative out of the National Academy of Public Administration, where, as I mentioned, Stan and I are both fellows, that's led by Ed DeSev, who was the former OMB Deputy for Management and the former leader for the Recovery Act implementation in the Obama administration, working with then Vice President Biden, called the Agile Government Center. And they're looking at a number of elements of how government can move forward in terms of increasing agility in the workforce and in its operations, and procurement's one of those lanes. So we'll put a link to the chat in that for those of you that are interested in learning more. Please keep putting in thoughts and questions in the chat as we go. There's a comment about the NDAA potentially as an opportunity to, rather than a champion, perhaps a champion vehicle to provide some requirements for active learning among the workforce. Any thoughts around that?
Well, the NDAA is the vehicle that you would do this in. I don't know if Congress really wants to get back into more legislation on OTAs at this point, only because they're waiting to see how DOD, DHS, and others do with the authorities they have. So I do think that is certainly one angle that ought to be worked, and at least from the discussions Jason and I have had with both committees, there seems to be a lot of interest in pushing this forward and making sure that it works. The second thing I just say as an aside to that is one of the interesting, or to me, one of the most interesting provisions in the House version of the defense bill this year is a provision that would require U.S. Space Command to use commercial items or services for its needs. And if they don't, they have to come to Congress and ask permission. This is like a complete 180 from where we were a number of years ago. So you can see there's substantial support in Congress to keep doing this. People keep saying, well, Congress is going to close the door. Congress will close the door if nobody's using the authority right and there's a bunch of problems. But if we're aggressive and do it right, I think there's plenty of support in Congress to move the process forward.
I would add too, I think OTAs are in a fairly good place after the 2017, 2018 NDAAs, plus what's been done. There is already a request out there for reporting. I think the services, one of the takeaways we had from talking to a lot of the senior acquisition executives was, right, we've given everybody all the authorities. Why aren't people using it? I think Congress is asking the same thing. And so, Congress is giving the authority. If the services seem to, and really this is at the lower level, at like the echelon 3 command level, are reluctant to use it because they're afraid that they are going to get they're going to get legal challenges and things like that. Go to contracting jail, which I'm still not convinced is a real thing. But really what Congress is saying and what senior executives are is, well, if you're not going to use this authority I gave you, we're going to take it away. And by the way, it's going to be painful because we're going to start really looking in and digging our finger into the wound and find out why you're not using this stuff. And so it's just like a culture of risk aversion in the services. And then, there's Congress is saying you can do this, and the risk aversion is saying, oh no, what's on the other foot. The second piece I'd say is back to the acquisition warfare type operations. So if we start looking at acquisition operations, in addition to what we're currently doing with our acquisition reform under the FAR and OTAs and that man, train, equip, we now have a new vertical by which we can go build out some NDAA language. And that is, how do I build out those trial cadres of acquisition folks? They're able to execute on this, right? How does this work with things like the national venture capital initiatives and things like the Army venture capital and Air Force ventures, right? How are we matching these with some of these venture capital initiatives? And how can we shape OTAs to achieve some of these operational missions? Flip that, how do we take what we learn from Operation Warp Speed and make it so we don't have to stand up ad hoc groups at the last minute when national security challenges present themselves? And I think we can do a lot within the NDAA to set ourselves up for success in the future.
So Dan, if I could, I'm going to, and I don't mean to usurp your role as the moderator of the discussion, but this is a perfect lead into this question that just popped up on the chat that I want to tie into here. And that,
Stan, you just went on mute.
okay, let's try that again.
There you go.
There's a question in the chat that what needs to be done to ensure greater participation by non-traditional defense contractors. And I think this links to this point about the NDAA and champions and so forth, because one of the things Congress is going to want to see is, are you actually getting non-traditionals in the game? Because otherwise, why would we do this? And the answer is kind of twofold. One is they are playing. I mean, there is very substantial engagement by non-traditional contractors across the spectrum of OTAs. What we found, if you look at the consortia, 70 to 75% of their members, in some cases, the large ones, are non-traditionals. In some cases, large percentages of dollars. I don't think that the issue is getting non-traditionals in the game today. I think it's keeping them in the game and creating a system that gives them comfort that there's growth opportunity within that marketplace. To use a sheerly crass marketing or business model, they have to know they have a market. So if they see a continued cycle of getting through research and development, but getting to that transition point to production and the FAR coming back down on them, that's going to limit or constrain their interest in participation. So if we can deal with those issues, particularly around IP, I would argue, also to some extent budget, there's plenty of money actually for research. There's not a lot of money to quickly translate that research into operational dollars. But if we can deal with that, I think that then it further incentivizes non-traditionals. Right now, there is a fair community of companies that really is seriously looking at it. But if we don't get this right over the next couple of years, they'll just look at Ultimate and say, you know what, it was a nice try, but it never got us where we need to go from a market perspective. And don't ignore the fact that Soraya Correa wants to push back on something one of us said.
Yeah, we're going to get to Soraya's question in a minute. Another great champion of procurement innovation who's joined us.
Let me jump
go ahead,
on
Jason.
the
Yep.
access for non-traditionals, right? So I was involved in some of the early documentation and planning for what became the Defense Innovation Unit. One of the early proposals was to the Chief Naval Operations, called the Silicon Valley Beachhead. Josh Steinman wrote the document. I helped staff it at the Pentagon. And the problem we were trying to solve, both with DIU and the folks out in Silicon Valley the Air Force folks at the at a cyber reserve element and the folks at the Hoover Center all identified the same issue. And that issue was that there is no good reason for a company to do business with the Department of Defense, right? Especially a venture-backed company. In fact, if you go in and you talk to a venture capitalist and you say that you have DoD contracts, they say, what the heck are you doing? That means that you are paying for government consulting services and not paying for engineering. We actually look at government investment as a risk. And on top of that, the companies that did want to do business with DoD didn't have a place to go and get help navigating the labyrinth, right? I've seen, even in the past couple of days, some people going back and pushing back under the CMMC argument that, well, companies, we have a $500 billion market. You want to do business with us. You should be expecting to spend more money with us. Yeah, we're $500 billion. Guess what? Amazon and Apple and Google have free cash on hand that's larger than that entire market share right now, right? We're not the biggest elephant in the room anymore, to Stan's point. DoD is not. And so the Department of Defense and the federal acquisitions needs to realize what your role is and realize the biggest barrier to engaging is the way we talk to businesses, the empathy piece, and helping them along. And if we are not actually going out and removing the barriers to those, process or otherwise, and providing a helping hand across that barrier, we're going to continue to be getting our butts kicked by other companies, by other countries' acquisition officials, lawyers, contracting officers that are going to make it easy for people, that are going to provide capital without backflips. And all of a sudden, we're going to end up with a whole bunch of artificial intelligence companies with, Chinese politicals on their boards because they needed investment and the U.S. was not there to do it, or it was too hard.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, that's my answer. We've got to change the way that the culture in DoD, and OTAs can be part of the solution.
Puts it in, again, the context of the great power competition that we talked about earlier. Yeah. And there's now an active discussion with Soraya Korea in the chat. So we're going to turn to that in just a minute. Soraya, of course, the former Chief Procurement Officer of the Department of Homeland Security and the founder of the Procurement Innovation Lab. It's done a lot of innovation in DHS and across the civilian space and with the national security community around innovation. An we get there, Steve Redburn, another former center author, my former colleague at OMB, asked a question about, are OTAs an element that can be support shared services solutions? In other words, could agencies come together and do an OTA type initiative around a shared service as opposed to a direct contract? Any thoughts on that?
I'll offer one just out of the gate, Dan. So I think the answer is yes, but I think it largely depends on the organization that's sort of manning that acquisition or that OTA. I mean, certain organizations, I think in my mind, exist to do just that. You look across the Department of Defense. I mean, DISA, for example, is a great one for that, or even the JAIC as they look to sort of enable and scale artificial intelligence. I think it really is all about how you construct the acquisition, right? More and more, we're seeing that clients are desiring to acquire end-to-end capability where they can just kind of turn the key and go, right? So truly running the entire stack, right? Be it from hosting all the way up through the application layer and being able to provide a capability as a service as opposed to the piece parts that kind of knit it together, right? So I think that's a good entree into, you build that capability, you can offer it out as a service, and then by extension, you enable the agency, who's sort of leading the OTA to offer that out as a shared service as a means to achieve their mission and support the rest of the department. So absolutely, I see it as a channel to do that.
Yeah, if you take it from and Jason had direct experience with this, if you look at the authorities governing Defense Innovation Unit, in effect, it's a shared service because the way it works is, and Jason, tell me if I got this wrong, but if once DIU enters into a production, and we transition from prototype to production with a vendor, anybody else in DoD can buy off that production contract without having to go back through the whole acquisition process. So in effect, it's a shared service of that kind of making access to that capability available across a variety of customers.
So one modifier, Stan, that you can actually do that in the prototype phase. You can apply additional capital and build new statement of works, new commercial contracts. They aren't DoD contracts, but they're actually contracts to do your work as long as it falls under that prototype. So both prototype and production, and then production gives you that contractor the ability to go out and find other people as well. Normally, the structure of a production OT will have a ceiling on it, which is why you saw things like the Rain Cloud had a $700 million ceiling, which was one of the biggest contentions. I think the first order on it was in the orders of like single-digit millions of dollars, but they had to put that ceiling on it in order to account for the expansion as it went into a DoD-wide contract, which is not a sole source contract. It is a competitively awarded contract through milestones.
I would note that Steve Redburn, who posted the question in the chat, was a co-author on another center report with Ed DeSev, who I talked about earlier, and Ken Buck, a procurement innovator from GSA, around incentivizing private sector capital to do what you all just described. How do you incentivize the private sector to kind of put forward capital in an innovative, both a budgeting perspective, because the budget rules can be friendly to investment or not, and also a procurement perspective, and we'll put the link to that in the chat. So let's turn to the very active discussion that Soraya's initial question raised around other players in agencies, the oversight personnel. We talked a little bit about this in terms of general counsels, auditors. What are your thoughts on how to work with those oversight elements to bring them into the tent so they don't create these barriers that we're seeing different participants in the chat speaking to?
Yeah, so Soraya's spot on with her question, and this is what we found. And when we talk about cultural barriers, it's really about various communities within the stakeholder community just not being comfortable with the process, objecting to it on some levels or whatever it might be, and causing some disruption. So she's absolutely spot on. And I'll let Jason go off on the legal community because that happens to be one of his favorite topics. But I think at a very high level, and this doesn't satisfy the problem, but at a very high level, what we're talking about here is nothing less and nothing more than a massive change management requirement. So we have to think about growing OTAs in the same way you think about change management as a discipline. How do you actually change an enterprise? How do you actually impact change? And it is not function by function, it is across, it is multiple stakeholder groups. Mike talked earlier way back at the beginning about customer focus and customer centricity. I think that's what it's going to take. And to Soraya's point, what we saw, at least at DoD, now this report was specific to DoD. We intentionally did not try to really get into any detail on the civilian side. So I apologize for folks who were looking for that in the report. But as I said earlier, what we found anecdotally is a lot of the drive for change is coming from people like Jason Knudsen 10 years ago. And that is, or 5 years ago, when he was active duty Navy, coming up through the system as a young officer and aware of the art of the possible and pushing his leadership to embrace that. And what I see, at least on the customer side at DoD, is a shift from where we were in the 90s. In the 90s, when I was pushing acquisition reform, it was very much civilian driven with some military support. I don't mean the military is opposed to it, but it was not being instigated, catalyzed from the uniform side. A lot of that seems to be shifting at DoD, where the uniform side is now really saying, we need to be moving in this direction. And I think when you get the customer talking that way and acting that way, then you can start to bring in all the other elements of the enterprise to achieve what the customer wants to achieve. You're going to have barriers. You're going to have legal barriers. I said earlier, when the financial side, you can get money for research, but trying to translate a prototype to a production contract in the PPBS process at DoD is a 3 or 4 year process, and all of a sudden you're way down the path. So there are other barriers, but I think the core is thinking about it as a classic change management challenge, and strategizing about it that way.
I guess
Jason, do you want to?
Yeah. So number one, I actually really love lawyers. I love lawyers who get to yes. And that the phrase that if I hear a lawyer say yes if instead of no, I'm very, very happy. And I actually grew up, like one of my assignments was I worked at the Counterterrorism Mission Management Center at the National Security Agency, working on counterterrorism for Afghanistan. And I watched, when Afghanistan and Iraq kicked off, there was a problem in DoD that a lot of the lawyers were just no lawyers. And several of the intelligence agencies went in and fired the lawyers and ended up getting lawyers who were get to yes lawyers. This doesn't mean that they were getting around stuff or they were acting illegally, but they were advising they were giving counsel that was, here is the pathway to get to yes. I can't endorse your way forward. So that's one. Two is that the lawyers, the legal team is an integrated part of your team. I think the legal team and your compliance folks need to be brought in at the beginning. And if you're not talking to them at the very beginning, you end up at the end where they go, "Oh my God, what just happened?" And that's when you get to know. And so when I talk the acquisition team, I really talk about acquisition professionals and including acquisition focused lawyers in that, as well as contract officers, program managers across the spectrum. Even your engineers in some of those organizations. So final point on that is really we are in not only a shift, this goes to Stan's change management, not only in a shift in the way we look at acquisitions and the movement to great power competition, but we're in a shift in the way we think about management and the organization of management. We are no longer a quality management, or the world is no longer quality management. However, DoD still very much is. The government very much is total quality management, which came out in 1998. Actually, 1996 was the Navy, and then full adoption. We even had a quality management center. The Department of Defense invented quality management. But now it's agility, right? We realize that taking these large, complex systems, and what we thought was if we just measured them appropriately and we applied systems engineering, that we could conquer complexity. If we remove people from the system, right, and replace them with requirements or replace them with, bodies of intellectuals who could tell you how human beings would react, right? We would send people to college to tell you what a person would do, and it was a complete failure. And that's how we run the acquisition system right now, right? We make things way too big. So in the future, the way I hope we organize, and hopefully this goes back to Chris Sember's question, we need to look at an agile formation, which is small, highly integrated teams working on just the amount of work that a team can conceptualize, completing that work, and then moving on to the next piece. And so what I really think is, because of that small integrated teams, this solves the legal counsel. The legal counsel definitely should be part of that in acquisitions. And if we cut that down, we can actually deal with risk in a much different way, because we can actually see what risk we're putting out there. And when we put out the risk into the world, that risk becomes actualized and we have to deal with it. My favorite phrase I ever heard, never be the last PM on an acquisition. Because as soon as you give it to the soldiers, sailors, airmen, that last PM, you actually pass all that risk on. Part of the reason I think we never field anything is because until you field it, you never have to take a risk. And we've got to change that. We've got to change it and field things constantly. And if we field things constantly, back to the OTA discussion, we have to have a flexible procurement system, a flexible acquisition system that is able to move as quickly and actually piece it up into smaller pieces. And then we need to be able to modify that in a flexible, rapid way based upon the things we learn. We can't get, 15 years down an acquisition cycle into a milestone review and be like, wow, all this stuff is out of date, but we already spent $100 million on this. I guess we're too big to fail. Let's just keep going and see if we can tweak it. That has always been a recipe for failure. Ask the Future Combat System, right? Ask the Bradley fighting vehicle. Like, that's where we fail. It's too big. Quality management. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Understood.
Okay, so-
And I would note that on the oversight piece, a number of the points you mentioned involve the concept of agile oversight. That's not an oxymoron. Actually, at the Pandemic Recovery Accountability Committee, Bob Westbrooks, who's a former Inspector General, has really championed this concept of agile oversight to kind of play into the structure that you're describing, Jason, and has done a number of interviews around how he's tried to set up the PRAC that way. We've got about 3 minutes left. I'm going to ask each of you to give a final comment. And there's been, in addition to this discussion of agility and risk management that continues in the chat, there was also discussion around competition. Do OTAs really reward competition? Do they bring in new players? That sort of thing. We've talked about that a little bit. And also a question around the Made in America executive order and its impact. So any thoughts on those last two questions as you wrap up? That's great. And why don't I start with Mike, just for closing thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I'll just close by underscoring what Jason just said, right? Which is, to keep pace with the innovation, the change that's necessary to really put us out front in the great power competition, we have to have the level of agility within the administrative side of DoD and the ability, the business back office processes that facilitate all this. We have to have that agility to enable that innovation. And so, we talk a lot about needing to acquire things like artificial intelligence and scale it across the department. Enablers such as OTAs, if we do them the right way, are going to be the keys to doing that. And it's something that, back to what Stan said earlier about a cultural shift, we have to embrace that. We have to drive it forward. So.
Thanks, Mike. Stan?
Yeah, I'll pick up on the question around the president's executive order on Made in America as sort of a closing thought. What that executive order, I think, identifies is a whole set of risk issues facing our economy, which have been well identified and well discussed. From an OTA perspective, it gives a little bit more impetus to this idea that we need to do a far better job of engaging with industry in this country in the commercial space to bring them into the federal marketplace. There's just too much capability out there that we're not yet accessing. We know what the challenges are. I mean, I think Jason would agree with me when I say we weren't shocked by anything we found in this report. We were a little taken aback by how vociferous folks were about the absolute barrier to bringing any non-traditionals across the line. But the solutions to that are there. They're clear. But I think what the president's executive order to me says is we have to have a much better engagement, not only with the U.S., but it's also about nearshore. It's not just onshore, it's nearshore. And I encourage people to look at today's Washington Post. There's a whole story already about companies thinking in terms of onshoring and nearshoring capabilities. There is going to be a significant shift in the economy. A lot of experts think we're going to see a new north-south axis and so forth. But all of this talks to the need for the government, whether it's for national security, for healthcare, for veterans, I don't care what the mission is, to be a part of that innovative ecosystem and what's happening, not an outsider looking in and try to cherry pick what looks good, but to be a customer at the table who's helping shaping what it looks like.
Thanks, Dan. When you said we need to do a far better job, I thought that might be a double entendre. Jason, 1 minute left. Closing thoughts.
Yeah. Last comment. So I see my good friend Gina Chima out there, fighting the good fight. She fights it every day, and I think Stan will agree with me. We came up with two major recommendations in this report. One was that we need more transparency and be able to see what's going on and measure the right things. The second is it's really about the people. And so we need to go out and train the workforce and get the workforce moving in the right direction. So Gina, keep out there, keep fighting the good fight. And I hope that everybody out there leverages OTAs, but really organizes it around making sure that our acquisition workforce is able to do the job that they're set out to do, and are able to protect the country, because that's what we're here for, not to go and fill out forms and appeal to a federal acquisition requirements. Like we own the system. Let's make the system do what we want it to do.
Mm-hmm. And I think Soraya puts a 5 exclamation point comment about that, about this really supports the mission, which all of you spoke to in various different ways. So that's terrific. Thank you all for a fantastic discussion. Thanks to everybody in the virtual audience for a terrific discussion in the chat. To one question, we will make this chat available, the links in the chat, and this will be available for on-demand viewing. We'll follow up with that so you can share it with your friends and colleagues. Talk about it over Thanksgiving dinner. Thanks again to Stan and Jason and your colleague Vincent for the inspiration for coming up with the report. And this is our mission as a center, is to really engage in dialogue and help government move forward in many different ways. And certainly over the last 90 minutes, we hope we've taken a small step to help in that regard with our colleagues in government and across industry. So thanks, Mike, again, Stan, Jason. Thanks, Ruth Gordon, who's been sort of lurking in the background, who's made all this possible. And have a good day, everybody.